And then I was like, well, let's see. That was why I kind of entered that area of study, because I was like, well, actually, at the end of the day, one thing I don't want to do is be the purporter of lies or false truths. A lot of people are willing to believe on an emotional level, but they're not willing to understand their belief on an intellectual level. And to me, the two should go hand in hand. I'm claiming that King Tutankhamun looked like this, and lo and behold,
Please
when you
repeat
look
that.
at
I
the
think
stat,
it's so powerful. People are willing to believe honor.
yeah, on an emotional level, and kind of just like say, oh well, I've always heard that this was this or that was that. But at the end of the day, you should be able to support your belief on on an intellectual level. You should be able to say, okay, well, I believe this, and I can support that by showing you X, Y, and Z.
I'm going to tease you a bit here. I'm talking to my guest right now. Here he is. No, that's me. Here's my guest. How do I even introduce you? Let me be cheeky and tease you a bit, because I know Nigerian men like teasing each other, just like, I don't want to say South African, like let's say most African men. He's the most European sounding black conscious brother I've ever met. Not just the sound of the language, but the sound of the name, Andrew King. Come on, man. Welcome, Andrew King.
Thank you very much.
Is that
I'm
is
my
that
name's
F you or thank you? It almost sounded
yeah,
like
yeah,
F.
right in the middle. No, first of all, King is not the given name. Okay, so King is a moniker that I've kind of adopted since I started the channel. People call me King, so I've adopted it into my name. My name is Andrew. Surname's Adetitan, which is a Yoruba surname, a strong Ondo State surname I have there. And I just kind of put the King on the end now as well, because it just people recognize it. That's all.
Please re-say or say your surname again.
Adetitun.
Adietitum.
Yeah, Titun with
Yeah,
an
it
N.
sounds Nigerian. Sounds Yoruba, you say?
Yeah, Yoruba, Ondo State.
Okay. What does it mean? Do you know? Or what does it refer to? Or...
Well, I know
Look,
that I Ade.
sorry.
So yeah, I don't know fully. I did know, and I probably should have written it down many years ago when I asked my uncle, but I'll go and ask him again. But I know the Ade refers to nobility, but
Okay.
then the Titun, I'm not so sure.
I don't want to say it's not a big deal, because I don't know what my surname stands for. My real surname, this Dinano Damano thing, is just nonsense I made up. My surname is
Mm,
Mekuto.
mm,
I don't know what it means. But my brother once went to Uganda and he said someone saw the surname, a native of Uganda, or a person who looked like a native, and they saw and they ran towards him, Mekuto, but he was in an elevator, a lift,
mm.
and it was about to close, so he was happy it closed because he didn't want to engage that guy.
I mean, I love that about your part of the earth and about the Bantu, for want of a better word, kind of like the Bantu spread. You guys are so connected, and I think many people, maybe not all, but lots of people aren't aware of how connected you are. I've been doing a lot of research into the Proto-Bantu film and its relationship to ancient Kemet. So, yeah, I like hearing stories like that. There's a deep connection. There's actually a thread that really just connects most African nations together. And that's what a lot of my work centers around, kind of deconstructing and finding these threads. Because you'll realize one thing I'm realizing is we're so connected as people. It's unbelievable.
6 degrees of separation, or is it less
Mm.
than that?
In Africa, less. In Africa, more and less, because we are the most genetically diverse part of the world. As we know, we're like 20 times more diverse than all of the rest of the world combined genetically. But then culturally, we're more aligned than the rest of the world. Probably several factors more aligned than most of the rest of the world combined. So we have this deep genetic kind of variety and mixture throughout the continent that the rest of the world just can't match. It makes us very strong human beings as well. But then counter to that, we also have this really deep running socio-linguistic cultural tie that ties a lot of African um, ethnicities together, and it's very interesting.
If you could give a title to today's conversation, or what you want to come out of today's conversation, how would you term it? I've got something on my side, but I want to hear how you'd want to theme it.
I would term it King and Dinano's deep dive into whatever Dinano wants to speak about. No, deep. Let's say deep dive into our African connections. Let's leave it there and leave it very broad and open
Okay.
because I feel like this conversation could go in any direction and it would be good.
Here's what I termed it, right?
Mm,
Reshaping, rediscovering, and retelling Africa's history. I somehow got that sense from checking out your channel.
mm.
His channel is called King's Monologue, correct?
The King's Monologue. Yes,
The King's
correct.
Monologue. It's on
Yes,
YouTube, and it's got a funky logo with Tupac's side profile with a crown on. Just tell us about how
yes,
you got to that point where you call it the King's Monologue.
yeah. So really, when I started the channel 2.5 years ago, I wasn't sure where it was going to end up. I didn't have a clear direction in terms of what I was going to do. All I knew is that I wanted to have a voice about certain things, and I like to speak. I like to monologue. So I thought, let me just, put together a few short and brief kind of like monologues and statements encapsulating aspects of Black and African hidden history that people don't teach about or speak about. Put that in a 1 or 2 minute monologue, along with some visuals, and see how that goes. And obviously, that's kind of like grown into what it's become today. So that's where the idea of the King's Monologue came from. And Tupac as an icon to me is very fitting. Um, I was expressing to you earlier, but that's obviously before we were recording, about the fact that Tupac expressed to me a version of self knowledge, self assuredness, and rebellion. I think these are all, by the way, aspects and characteristics that we as melanated people need to have. We need to have a rebellious nature because essentially we're in a position where, regardless of where we go to in the world, people dislike us for no good reason. That's a fact. That's not victim mentality, this, that, and the other. It's just a fact. It doesn't matter where you get on a plane and get off. You're going to be, by default of just stereotype and kind of first impressions, you're going to be the most disliked person as a melanated person. That's just the world that we have to find ourselves in. So you have to be really comfortable with a spirit of rebellion and not trying to please others. And I feel Tupac kind of encapsulated that, and that's very much kind of like speaks to my character. I really don't care what. The only people that affect me are other Black people. I am really unaffected by people who aren't kind of part of the Black and melanated community. I don't really care what they do or don't think about me. It's just the way I've been built.
Is there a deeper meaning or need for you to be why? Okay, is there a deeper need? Why? I don't know how to phrase this. Is there a deeper understanding or something deeper to you being affected by what Black people think, besides, or as opposed to how you're indifferent about how other people think of you?
No, that's a really good question. I think yes, there is, and I think because I was pondering this the other day, because I still get really annoyed. Like I've got a load of channels, by the way, and a load of creators and a load of people out there who really desperately hate my channel. They troll it, they create content about it, they subscribe and comment multiple times on every single thing that I output, and as long as they're not Black, I found that I'm relatively, I don't care. I find it hilarious. I'm just like, haven't you got anything better to do than to follow me around? All you're doing is proving that what I'm doing and what I'm saying is correct, because otherwise it just wouldn't bother you to this degree. But then I think when you see that kind of resistance come from within the black community, I think subconsciously I know that every time black people, melanated people, black ethnicities, every time we've failed, it's always been with the assistance of a certain sect of our community. They can never do this in isolation. You know, I was looking the other day at just the pictures when they captured Lumumba. This is something I don't like talking about too much because obviously, for obvious reasons, it's upsetting talking about it. But he's surrounded by black soldiers. You know, so ultimately, yes, we can blame Belgium, and we know that they were Belgium and the CIA were responsible for his ultimate demise. But the people that did the legwork were melanated people that didn't see the value in what he was doing. So I think that might be the seed. Yeah, I still I still it does bother me when black people aren't aligned about this, when we're not on code, so to speak.
Give us a background of who you are, Andrew King. Uh, your interests, why you're focusing on what you're focusing in terms of whatever research you do, whatever content you do, and how whatever research and content that you're doing has got you from whatever place you were at to the place you are right now.
Yeah. Sure. Ironically, this is probably the most uninteresting thing that I like to do, but I'll do it regardless. I'm a qualified teacher. I've been qualified for some 20 years now, but I don't teach as a profession anymore. Um, and I think I was in and around the time, well, probably a few years before I qualified as a teacher, that I started getting into Black history, and my first introduction into the Black history space was the African Origins of Civilization, a book that was written by Sheikh Anta Diop, and it just obviously highlighted and brought to the front that Black people were the progenitors of the ancient Egyptian civilization. And this was something that I think I had as kind of like background knowledge, but didn't know how explicitly real it was. And then I started, that kind of like developed my hunger for learning more. And I've read since then probably hundreds of books just in and around the subject, but also just wanted to learn more about ourselves as a people, as black people in the diaspora, black cultures around the world. And I guess it just snowballed, where I thought, when it hit, I think it was like 2022, when I've actually made networks before. So around 2008 I started a group called Ancient Kemet, the Egypt They Never Show You, on Facebook, and that group grew to like 70K followers. So I've kind of done dipped and dabbled and built social networks before, and then I kind of like left that to moderators and administrators. But I think after 2020, it just felt like it was the right time in terms of what the world went through. I'd always been quite fearful of being upfront about Black history and about Black knowledge. I always kind of felt that fear that things can happen to people when they speak out. And something happened between 2020 and 2022, when I just didn't care anymore. And I just felt like the ancestors told me it's the right time. It's just like, no, it's the right time. Just share now. Don't worry. That dispensation of fear was warranted, but it's past. We're now in a new dispensation. It's time for people's eyes to be open. It's time for you to let them know what you know. And that kind of brought me to launching the channel. And then since then, I've done obviously it started off with, like you said, a few kind of like monologues. Then I went into doing the reconstructions, which kind of coincided with a background in computer science and art and graphic design, which I'd kind of like amassed over the years. And it all kind of came together quite nicely to be able to do the reconstructions and to show the world something that always seen in the Egyptian artwork. And I think this world did a really good job at kind of like blinding our eyes as to or as to how the ancient Egyptians presented themselves. So I think doing the reconstructions was quite important for me because I'm quite a visual person. And I would say in all the books that I've read, it's the ones that were supported by visuals that had the biggest impact on me. So I knew that when I started teaching African history, I had to be visual with it as well so that people understood or at least could relate to what they were looking at. So that's the kind of a long answer to your question.
It's not long. It
Okay,
suffices. Who's your
good.
favorite black tea?
Lovely. Queen Tea. It's a little bit of a pun there. It's a t-shirt that I actually sell on my on my shop. This is my favorite black tea, and this is my favorite black tea. But this is also one of my reconstructions of Queen Tea. That, in my view, looks exactly like her bust. It's ironic that we get gaslit as a black community when we make reconstructions that look exactly like the statues. They tell us to stop blackwashing.
Who is she?
That's the yeah. Sorry.
Who is she?
Oh, so Queen T is the or Taye. By the way, I was calling her Queen T. Her name was Queen Taye, and Taye is a very common Yoruba name. I'm not saying that she's Yoruba. Once again, I'll say these things just to cast that kind of combining, string that kind of finds its way around all African nations. So her name is Queen Taye, a very common Yoruba name. She's the mother or grandmother of Tutankhamun. We're not sure if it's mother or grandmother. There's a dispute in that area. Um, but he's the grandmother or mother of Tutankhamun. Um, and she was married to Amenhotep III, who was the richest man in, well, they say richest man in history, was the, I would say, the king of the richest um, dynasty in history right up until the reign of Mansa Musa. So, yeah, historically, wealth has always been on the African continent. That's another thing that's kind of like ignored because the richest man was Amenhotep III, and then after him was Mansa Musa, and then Mansa Musa wasn't beat up until modern times with this kind of new wealth that we
I've
have.
I've always heard of Mansa Musa, and then
Mhm.
Hotep. What were his riches about? Mansa, they say it was the Malian kingdom, or whatever they
Mm.
called it, the emperor, the Mali Empire, or whatever they called it, and his riches were in gold reserves. There's
And
also
salt,
a story and
yeah, salt as well.
salt. Okay,
Yeah,
the
salt's a big,
seasoning.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
So salt. He had control of the trade routes for salt and the gold routes as well. So it's more. It was not just their kind of like mineral resource. It was more their strategic location, essentially between the Sahel and the Mediterranean, and everything that passed through that region kind of went through Mali, and they exploited that really well. So the salt trade was a massive trade because salt was obviously the ancient equivalent of having a fridge in terms of preserving goods, particularly in hot climates. If you want to preserve for a long time things, you would. Don't know if the word is. I don't think the word is brine, but you would basically immerse them in salt. You know what stockfish is like in Africa. We have
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So yeah, so gold, salt, and books as well. Books was a massive part of the Mali Empire. Songhai Empire was this sale of the production and sale of manuscripts. They had the most educated people, and so we're able to produce the most written manuscripts and sell those globally. So these are just a few things. I don't think it was limited to those, but those are kind of like some of the major products they used to export.
Now, if me browsing through your YouTube channel speaks to what you're really interested in, I saw a couple of videos, one specifically looking at this grandson or child of Queen, I'll call it Queen T. I can't say the name now. This Egyptian ruler or king,
Mm.
Kuneptum. What's his name?
Um, Child of Queen T,
Yeah.
Akhenaten.
Okay. Is it the one
Is that the one?
is it the one you recently did a video on where you look at
That's Tutankhamun.
oh Tutankhamun? Okay.
Yeah, that's Tutankhamun.
Okay. So
So
it's
I
not the
mean,
same person.
yeah, so go on.
No, no, no. I was just thinking now. You've done a deep dive
Mm.
into Tutankhamun, as you said, and I think there were some reconstructions of who he is, and he was portrayed or made to look like a Eurasian, European, or Asian, maybe Arabic looking type person, but you look at the features of the skull and the possibilities of how the anatomy, not only of the face, the makeup of the face, but the proportions of the torso to the rest of the body. Just give us a background into the interest in looking at that, and why do you think such breakdowns of these mummies or these ancient Egyptian figures are so important?
Yeah. So yeah, like you said, I've got a video and I've done quite a few deep studies into Tutankhamun. It's quite ironic because he was the first reconstruction that I ever did. And obviously, one of the early criticisms I got when I started making, I believe in giving primacy, by the way, to the art. So if you're going to make a reconstruction of someone, you find a portrait. That to me just seems logical. I don't think there should be any argument about that. We do it with ancient Greece, we do it with ancient Rome, but it seems like it's only with ancient. We do it even with Mesopotamia, wherever it is, Persia. It's only with ancient Egypt that the artwork suddenly becomes not good enough, and we must scan the mummies. And when we don't even have an intact mummy, we must scan the skull and then call in a European forensic expert to reconstruct the skull based on our Arab slash Eurasian biases. So one of the early criticisms I used to get is, oh well, it doesn't match the skull, and then I was like, well, let's see. That was why I kind of entered that area of study, because I was like, well, actually, at the end of the day, one thing I don't want to do is be the purporter of lies or false truths. A lot of people are willing to believe on an emotional level, but they're not willing to understand their belief on an intellectual level. And to me, the two should go hand in hand. I'm claiming that King Tutankhamun looked like this, and lo and behold, when
Please
you
repeat
look
that.
at
I
the
think
stat,
it's so powerful. People are willing to believe honor.
yeah, on an emotional level, and kind of just like say, oh well, I've always heard that this was this or that was that. But at the end of the day, you should be able to support your belief on on an intellectual level. You should be able to say, okay, well, I believe this, and I can support that by showing you X, Y, and Z. And the fantastic thing about being in this area of study, for myself being the Africa's Nile Valley, is that what's available in terms of anthropological data always supports our findings. Now, the fantastic job that Egyptology has done and the modern media, I'd say less Egyptology now. Historically, it was Egyptology, but now even the Egyptologists are on board that it's an African civilization. But historically, they've always done a good what they've always made a good job of is basically finding stuff that stuff that they find out doesn't support their narrative, and so they abandon it as a field of investigation. And that kind of brings me on to the question you asked regarding, King Tutankhamun's anatomy. Yeah, if you look at him anthropometrically speaking, studies were done. These studies go starting from the 50s right up until the mid 90s. One study that I quote from a couple of times is a study by Professor Gay Robbins, which looks at his anthropometric proportions. And black people, as most people on this channel will know, Africans, we are anthropometrically, and that is the length of our limbs, etc., are different. They are divergent from your average Eurasian. Average Eurasian has a longer torso, shorter legs, shorter arms. Africans have longer arms, shorter torso, longer legs. We'll see this. I always give the example. We see this, like for instance, in distance runners. Okay, African distance runners have that kind of like anthropomorphic advantage, but we also see it in just simple things like combat sports. I'm a big UFC slash boxing fan, and if a black guy and a white guy fight and they're the same height, who's going to have the reach advantage?
Reach, yeah. Usually the
Black, the
Africans.
black guy's going to have, yeah, that black guy, the black person will, I would say, not 100% of the time, but 99% of the time have a reach advantage over a white person who he fights who's the same height. Okay, these are truisms. These are consistent things that are inherited, over time. These are what Shimon Keita would call adaptions or adaptations. So the long limb, short torso is called a tropical adaptation, whereas the long torso, short limbed is called a cold adaptation. So it gives you a good indication about where and how people have evolved. Okay, has someone evolved in a tropical region or has someone evolved in a cold region? Now, Tutankhamun's anatomy, unsurprisingly, aligns perfectly with black people, and that's consider. I'm talking not just black people in East Africa, West Africa, also black people in the Americas. They came up with these equations, which were essentially the white equation and the Negro equation. That's how divergent the two kind of populations were. So you had the white average and the Negro average, and King Tutankhamun's limb proportions fell right in the middle of the Negro average or the Negro equation. The way this was proven is that they took measurements of his humerus, his femur, and his tibia. Okay, those are kind of like three major long bones in your arms and your legs, and they ran them through this equation. And what you should see, if the equation is correct, is the production of the same height. And that's exactly what you got. We have a height of 1.69 for King Tutankhamun based on the Negro equation. Now, the only way you can get this, if you ran those same measurements through the European or the white equation, you would get three different heights. So they wouldn't correspond because the equation will give you this. So that proves that he had the body of a continental native. Let's just not be coy, black African. So that's just one example of many that I cover in that video.
Yeah, I picked that up. I remember because I'm into running, so I remember seeing a guy that I really respect in the running world, Eliud Kipchoge, when we were looking at this anatomy of the body, who is the fastest man, I think the second fastest man to ever run the marathon, and then the fastest man that was tipped to break that 2-hour record. Is it Calvin Kiptum? He somehow died in a car accident.
Oh wow.
Question mark on that one. Anyway,
Oh.
why do you think it's so important to reconstruct? I think that's a term you used.
Mm.
I say reshape, retell this identity of ancient Egyptians or the identity of ancient Kemet. Why do you think it's
Mm.
so important? Why can't we leave it to these European researchers? Why do we have to take Sheikh Anta Diop, who they somehow questioned the
Mm.
legitimacy of his research, but he's probably one of the most respected, well, depending on who you talk to, Egyptologists. They question a lot
Mm.
of his research and his claims that ancient Kemet or the dynasties of ancient Egypt were actually black African people. Why do you think
Mm.
it's important to correct this history?
I think it's important to correct all black history, and I think people will be shocked as to how deep the rabbit hole goes. For instance, the work that you're doing on your channel, where I've seen so many Africans coming to the realization that biblically, these places can be found on the African continent. So I'm just playing my part on this side, but I feel like this is playing itself out in several places around the world at the moment where people are realizing, hey, these archaic people, these were black people. And not only were they just black, they also had a close relationship to the people of the African continent. So for me, it's about correcting falsified information that we've been given. So if you're looking at the ancient Egyptian civilization, it's important to correct because it's true. That ultimately is the driving force here. And the thing about it is people have this mindset where they are fearful of upsetting the apple cart. They're fearful of saying things that people won't agree with. Sheikh Anta Diop, when he first put this idea forward that the ancient, well, actually, you could say Chancellor Williams before him, but when these ideas were being first placed forward by these really brave trailblazers, they were standing in an oasis of lies that essentially said black people were worthless, we are historical slaves, we've never done anything. And they were saying, hey, you might say that, but we've got some contradicting evidence here. we're holding on to something here that actually contradicts exactly what you say. And I can look at this as someone who's just making a cursory observation, and I can tell you, I am familiar with these people. I am familiar with this civilization, and I am familiar with this culture. That's something that's really important. The ancient Egyptian civilization, I think one of the reasons why I've stayed on it for so long, and I haven't kind of like moved on to other things. And I do touch on other aspects of history, but what reason I keep coming back to ancient Kemet is because it's so rich. We have so much living kind of information, and so every time I feel like it's time to move on, something else gets, deciphered, or I understand something more. And drawing these real time ties and connections between ancient Egypt and modern African cultures and ethnicities and societies. Even we were speaking earlier about the Bantu and how much I've learned. I mean, you're talking to someone who a couple of years ago didn't really know anything. I thought Bantu was just a term used to describe a certain type of Black African. Like, and that's what most white South Africans probably believe. Oh no, you're not Khoisan, you're Bantu. I mean, that's how they think. They don't understand this is a very rich ethno-linguistic culture that travels its way right from the Africa's Great Lakes region right down into Southern Africa, and has a rich, not just linguistics, but cultural continuity between these people. So, me focusing, to answer your question again, sorry, going back, me focusing on ancient Egypt, I feel is just essentially my part. I've come to a stage now where I understand, I have a depth of understanding when it comes to ancient Egypt, and it will be irresponsible of me to abandon that. I need to carry on digging and carry on finding these links. And ultimately, it's also enriching the other research that I do, because I'm realizing how much it connects to other strands of research that I'm going into. And when I'm saying other strands, I'm talking as far afield as Britain. Yeah, the foundational black British population, which is, to some people, those words already is going to make their brain melt. Like, what are you talking about? It's like, no, you have to understand, we were first everywhere. Black people were first everywhere. That's a scientific, anthropological, historical fact. What they've done, or done a very good job of, is separating us from that fact and making us see history through their lens. And us seeing Egypt as a white civilization is the same as us seeing all of these other civilizations as white civilizations. There's been a job of whitewashing done on global history. So, yeah.
Why do you think there's so much obsession about Egypt? Is it the pyramids? Is it the Nile River? Is it the story of the Exodus and how the Israelites, whatever you might want to call them, were enslaved there? For example, I've recently heard, maybe not recently, maybe about 20 or so years ago, that Sudan
Mm.
has more pyramids than Egypt. That's in terms of quantity, not in terms of scale,
Yep.
correct? But
Correct.
you almost always hear about Egyptian pyramids.
Mm.
You, the research, the interest, why not maybe look at Sudan and its significance in the history of black people?
I think that Sudanese Kushology research goes hand in hand. And I think that's part of the investigation, because we're taught Egyptology from a Eurocentric perspective. So there's always this effort to act like whenever you see the Sudanese, the Nubians, the Kermans, the Napatans, the Merowites, these are the various names that, the various ethnicities south of Egypt, or south of Kemet, I should say, went by. They're always, by the Egyptologists, they'll always say that, oh, they were copying the Egyptians, or they were colonized by. It's this modern presentist language that they give, this kind of modern idea of Africans being inferior. Here's what's ironic: when we look at the texts and we look at the historians that aren't tainted by modern racism. So if we look at the ones that they love, such as Herodotus, Diodorus, Plato, Socrates, all of them refer to Ethiopia. That's what they called it back. The Greeks and the kind of Greco-Romans, the Hellenes called them the Ethiopians, the Central Africans. Ethiopia, by the way, to be clear, Ethiopia in those times is Central Africa going right to the Atlantic coast. So it's the region that became went on to become the Sudan, okay, or well, we now kind of know it as the Sahel and Guinea and part of the Sahara region. But it's that entire region from the Atlantic coast right up to Abyssinia, which is modern Ethiopia. Ironically, Abyssinia was never called Ethiopia, but it's now called Ethiopia, which is a part of the mind game they played with the toponyms and messing around with where things were. But yeah, so the Ethiopians, when referred to by Diodorus, for instance, Diodorus is quite explicit. He says that the Egyptians learnt their language from Ethiopians. The Ethiopians wrote first and taught them the hieroglyphs. And actually, the Ethiopians are superior in terms of their hieroglyphs, in that the whole nation, all people in Ethiopia can write using hieroglyphs. But when it comes to Egypt, only the priests can write using hieroglyphs. They talk about the fact that Herodotus talks about the fact that Egypt is an Ethiopian colony. So they believe that the Egyptians are, Herodotus' exact words are, the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians. We believe this is the case because of their black skin and woolly hair. So the ancient historians are much more unequivocal, about the relationship that exists between kind of Ethiopia slash Kush and Kemet, and B, about the order, of importance, the order of primacy. They always view Ethiopia as the quote unquote superior civilization, and Egypt as kind of one of their, you know, outposts, for want of a better word. So I agree with you. Understanding that part of the world is important, but here's where we're limited. We have so much more in the world of excavation that's happened on Egypt. So it's just that all that happens is that we're much more saturated with information about Egypt, which is why Egypt does get a disproportionate amount of the focus. Now, there are researchers like Professor Manu Ampin, who I mentioned earlier, who are doing excavations in Kush and that part of the world. And there's a lot of opposition. There's
Sorry,
efforts to
sorry,
turn.
Andrew. Are
Go
they
on.
African?
Yes, well, he's an
Oh,
African American professor, Manu Ampim,
oh, great.
but he's doing work. Here's the problem: they're currently trying to turn the Nile south of Egypt into a series of lakes and creating these massive flood zones that will flood antiquities. You know already about the building of Lake Aswat, not
No.
Lake Nasser.
Mm-mm.
So in the 1940s, they built a lake, an artificial lake, over the richest um, archaeological site probably in history. And they did this because they knew this site, they could never pass any of these antiquities off for being black. And I'm talking, this is going back to, we're talking about pyramids, structures, temples,
Okay. Where is
um,
this?
tombs. This is south. So this is basically, it was over us. What it was, the lake is called Lake Nasser, and it deluged the area of Aswan or Sawanet, which was basically furthest south of Egypt. Um, and it was built in the 1940s. They moved Abu Simbel. So you know Abu Simbel, the big kind of temple with the four statues of Ramesses. You've definitely seen it. Four statues of Ramesses. Yeah, so they relocated that. That's one of the only things they saved. So they actually cut that temple. It was carved into a mountain. They cut the mountain up and they relocated it, I think, 60 meters higher to avoid the deluge. But
So
can
this
you
is
imagine?
all happening in Egypt, or it happened in
Yeah,
Egypt. The Lake
all
Nasser, you
happened.
say?
Yeah, yeah, all happened in Egypt. And they flooded. This place was rich in antiquities. They're very aware of it, like rich. It was a 100% African historical, as in terms of Africa's antiquity, hack job. It was like, we need to deluge this, we need to hide it, we need to bury it, and we need to make sure no one ever finds it. That's what it was. there's no protocol, there's no kind of comparison in history of UNESCO allowing for such a massive archaeologically significant historical site to be flooded. It's unbelievable what they did. And people don't realize the area that they flooded here isn't a small area, it's the size of a small country. And they completely deluged it. So this is, this is what we're dealing with in Black history. um, our history, where possible, has been destroyed, has been flooded, has been hidden, has been burnt, has been. They do whatever they can to stop the world from ever seeing Black historical artifacts, and they know exactly what they're doing. Um, and by the way, I wouldn't. My research and investigations lead me to believe that they've done this not only several places on the African continent, but they've done it in the Americas as well. The Americas is full of lakes that they claim are ancient but shouldn't be there.
Oh man,
Yeah.
interesting information. But it's concerning these things that you're bringing up, and that's why I had to be specific about the person that you had mentioned, that you said they are doing research in Sudan or Ethiopia. I recently got interested in just a comparison between the Congo Basin and the Amazon Basin.
Mm,
Fiddling with these large language models, but I realized that there hasn't been as much extensive research on
mm,
the Congo Basin as there has been on the Amazon Basin,
mm,
which made me think then that there's a lot to be unearthed, there's a lot to be discovered. Don't want to say discovered, rediscovered in African history and in African ancient times and ancient ways of living. If it's something I want to pursue, but the monetary implication implications of such. But it's something we're willing to start sooner than later. What type of traveling or research or location based research have you personally done on these things that you speak of, or is it mostly desktop based?
I'll admit it's definitely at the moment mostly kind of remote research. I've visited multiple museums across Europe. So I've been to the Louvre, the Noyes, I've been to the Vatican, all for research purposes. So, and obviously British Museum and local museums across the UK. So Bristol Museum, Chiddington Castle. So I've conducted lots of museum research. I started going to Africa, well, back to Africa, so to speak, a couple of years ago now. Um, and I realized that I'm just going to make that a regular stop for me to really do more primary research in Africa. And I think coming on to your observation about excavations in Africa, I am with you 100%. I do believe they're going to yield significant results. But we need to, first of all, convince Africa and our people that there's something to look for, and I think that's the work that we're doing here initially to really show people, look, for instance, let's take Timbuktu and the Timbuktu manuscripts that were recovered, um, largely thanks to your great president Thabo Mbeki, one of my favorite presidents on the African continent. He worked hand in hand with Mali to make sure that those manuscripts were recovered. If that work wasn't done, we wouldn't have them now, and we wouldn't have the proof and the narrative that Africans weren't just prolific writers. We actually wrote that one nation, Timbuktu, produced 50 times the manuscripts of the entire continent of Europe up until the production of the printing press. So one single African nation provably and verifiably produced 50 times the amount of written manuscripts than the entire continent of Europe. And Europe only caught up when after the invention of the printing press. So this is very significant. But we wouldn't have any of that knowledge. We wouldn't have this rich history of Timbuktu. Timbuktu would still be a, I think you know, in English language, Timbuktu, up until very, very recent times, was considered a kind of a throwaway term for a place that you're never going to find, for a place that doesn't exist.
Are you for
You know,
real?
the English people. Yeah, yeah, English people would use Tim. So growing up, I thought Timbuktu wasn't a real place
A
because I'd heard it.
mythological location of some sort.
Yes, because you'd hear it used as a throwaway term. So people are, oh yeah, it's gonna, I'm gonna have to do something between here and Timbuktu if I'm ever gonna find it. Like that's
Oh,
the kind
okay,
of. So
okay,
it was
okay.
very common to
I've
use
heard that
Timbuktu
phrase. Yeah.
as a, yeah, as a kind of like, you're never going to find this place. This place doesn't exist. And then lo and behold, I'm reaching adulthood and I'm realizing not only is Timbuktu a real place, it's the most significant place when it comes to um, the history of modern education, because it essentially birthed the modern education system. It was the first place to produce graduates, so to speak. That's all a African invention, okay? A Central West African invention that they would have you believe was this mythical place, and that's putting aside the fact they also had the richest person and the richest
Mm.
empire in
Mansa
history.
Musa.
Putting aside all those facts, you know, this is in terms of the up until the medieval era. This was easily the most significant civilization in global history for at least a span of 200 to 300 years.
You know what's disturbing, Andrew? I recently
Mm,
saw something to the effect that most of the manuscripts were actually burnt down.
mm.
The ones that are actually available now are a fraction of what was there.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. There's a couple of things to note here. First of all, Timbuktu exported a majority of its manuscripts. So when you see these texts that appear in different places across the Islamic world, you know, like Afghanistan and Iraq, etc., they have the different script types like the Maghrebi script and the Hausa script. They're written in the different forms of Islamic text. A great deal of those would have been produced in Timbuktu and then exported. Now, that's fair enough because that could happen anywhere over the world. We tend to not always be 100% sure where things come from, and it's particularly difficult in the Islamic world where everyone is speaking Arabic. So I'm not going to accuse anyone of something there, but I also know that archaeologists could make more effort to say this is probably of, you know, Timbuktu origin because it's covered in, let's say, for instance, Nigerian leather. Nigeria, by the way, produced some of the highest quality leather for a long period of time in history. Was the number one leather exporter. So, but that could be a big clue as to something perhaps being produced in Timbuktu. But they might not look into it because it might not serve a narrative or something that they want to go into. That being aside, the burning of manuscripts, which you just mentioned there, that's significant because we don't know exactly how destructive Europeans were in Africa, although we know they were unspeakably destructive. But we don't know the limits. We don't know the extent of it because of their Operation Legacy. Are you aware of Operation Legacy?
No?
Okay, so the British had a policy called Operation Legacy, and it's widely believed that this policy was shared across the Allied nations, i.e., France, Germany, etc., etc. And this policy essentially was when they realized the whole colonial experiment was coming to a close and African nations were finding their independence, etc. Um, in the build up to that, they burnt all documentation, everything. So not just their own, anything that was written in any of the European colonies burnt. They said that the burning was so bad or so universal and so broad that in certain parts of, I think one of the places that they spoke about was in Kenya, that you were literally knee high in ashes. That's how extensive the burning was. So a lot of
What,
people kind
what's
of
the
cling onto
operation
this
called again? What's the name of the operation?
Operation Legacy. You're
Okay.
gonna find very limited. I'm doing a big bit of research into it at the moment. I've got a couple of books, but that's all I've been able to find. because they burnt everything. So you're not going to get a huge amount of text about it. The only reason we know about it is because the Mau Mau's, the descendants of the Kenyans who'd been taking Britain to court all this time, managed to stumble across like a couple, I think it was like a couple thousand documents.
I'm finding
Operation
something
Legacy.
here on
Mm.
Wikipedia.
Oh, Wikipedia. We don't do
Yeah, I know,
Wikipedia.
I know, but I mean, it's giving us an idea, right?
I call it WSpedia.
Okay,
Yeah.
it says Operation Legacy was a program of the British Colonial Office, later Foreign Office, to destroy or hide files that would implicate the British Empire in wrongdoing, as to prevent them from being used by their ex colonies. It ran from the 1950s, which is run about the time most African or a lot of African countries were getting their independence from the British, right? Until the 1970s, when the decolonization of the British Empire was at its height and involved at least 22
Okay.
countries.
And just to be
So hold
clear,
on, hold on, hold on. Let's just read this part. I think it's important. The MI5 or special branch agents were required to vet all secret documents in the colonial administrations to find those that could embarrass Britain or show racial prejudice or religious bias. Some 8,800 files were consequently stored in Britain. Precise instructions were given for methods to be used for destruction, including affirming what you've just said, including burning and dumping at sea. Some of the files detailed, some of the files detailed methods of torture used against opponents of the colonial administration, such as during the Mau Mau uprising. So it just confirms and affirms what you've just said. Sorry, carry on.
No, it's okay. And the reason, as bad as that sounds, the reason why I didn't want to use Wikipedia for this is because ultimately Wikipedia is going to sanitize it. So already they've sanitized the dates. The dates are the early nine. Remember, a lot of this can't be confirmed, but the estimates say early 1900s to the 1970s. So a period spanning probably more around 50 years. And also, it also deliberately avoids trying to give any kind of indication of numbers other than what had been found. So 8,500 documents have been found, but the reality is that millions, probably billions of documents across Britain's colonies had been destroyed. In addition to this, what it doesn't speak about is the destruction of African texts, because a whole massive part of this was this push to make Africa seem like an illiterate continent. And even we have embraced that, and we come to this kind of like conclusion that, oh, Africans didn't really care about writing things down. We were oral. Yes, we were oral, but we were very literal. In fact, it's proven in the fact that we have at least two very what's the word? Two spontaneous, that's the word I was looking for. We have two spontaneous origins of written script on the African continent, at least, probably more. Okay, but hieroglyphics and ajamis, ajami, insibidi, hieroglyphics and insibidi. These are spontaneous scripts. Now, to be clear about how significant that is, globally, there's only really four in the history of mankind writing. Okay, all scripts descend from these four kind of origin points. We have one in Mesoamerica, we have one in China, which some people say is related to the African one anyway. We have the ancient Egyptian one, and then we have the Insibidi in West Africa. So two of mankind's known written systems originate on the African continent, and yet they're given us this narrative that Africans didn't like or appreciate writing. It's a
Okay.
load of rubbish.
There's a book I'm looking at here, but I'm just going to mention it. It's on Amazon. It speaks to this operation we're speaking about. But I wanted to touch a bit on this in CBD. We know about the ancient Egyptian way of writing hieroglyphics, right? But I've never heard of in CBD. Maybe we can just touch on it a bit. But I'm just reading here. There's a book on Amazon called Operation Legacy from 2023, Looting and Losing Africa's Kingdoms. Maybe it's a book one would want to look it up. Oh, there you go. There you go. Guy, is that the book you are referring to? Hold it up again. Please hold it up
So
again, Andrew.
sure, that's one of the books.
Yeah, that's the
It's
one I'm seeing here. It says,
limited.
okay, it's a limited edition. Okay, the
No, 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 no.
synopsis.
I was gonna say it's limited in its contents
Oh, is it?
because yeah, because you're going to struggle at this stage. Operation Legacy, we only found out about it the other day. It's not like something we've known for decades. This is something that came as a result of the ongoing efforts, and I give them so much commendation of those people who were putting, who are bringing the British military and the British government to court for those brave Kenyans who are doing that. It's very necessary because they've just gotten away with so many of their crimes. But that's the only reason it's come to light. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know about Operation. The whole idea behind Operation Legacy was that you was never supposed to find out about it.
Hmm.
So much of what we're going to learn about what was destroyed relies on us now utilizing some of the information that we've been able to find, such as the Timbuktu manuscripts, and seeing what they say about Africa. That's one of the things that I'm really keen on doing, is actually understanding what the Timbuktu manuscripts say about African people, African places. I've learned quite a lot from what the Portuguese said, and what the Portuguese said in the 1600s and the 1500s and even the 1400s about African kingdoms is a stark contrast to what the British said about them in the 1800s. So there was a massive deconstruction we already know between that 200 or 300 year period where Africa was massively brought to heel by the by European incursion. So much of our rebuilding is going to be us figuring out what was there and then being able to say, well, we know what you've destroyed now. But I don't think it's going to be really hard to find an exhaustive text because they didn't even risk keeping evidence of what they had destroyed. They just wanted it to be a complete and utter, you know, no one ever talks about it again.
Tell us
So
more
it's
about.
a rewriting of history, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
This is a point in time where they wanted to rewrite history. It's the only thing that would motivate you. All of these excuses about embarrassing the Queen, that's a load of baloney. It's nothing to do with embarrassing the Queen. It's the fact that you had committed so many crimes against antiquity and against people, including some of the things you touch on, the muddying and the renaming of the continent, so people don't know what the original names of places were, so that when they're reading the Bible, they don't go, "Oh, I know where that is.
Mm,
Calvary,
mm,
Calvary. That's
mm,
Calabar. That's over there in Nigeria." No, they don't
mm,
want people to know that.
mm.
you know, so yeah.